Now the men who were holding Jesus in custody were mocking him as they beat him. They also blindfolded him and kept asking him, "Prophesy, who is it that struck you?" And they said many other things against him, blaspheming him. When day came, the assembly of the elders of the people gathered together, both chief priests and scribes. And they led him away to their council, and they said, "If you are the Christ, tell us." But he said to them, "If I tell you, you will not believe, and if I ask you, you will not answer. But from now on, the Son of Man shall be seated at the right hand of the power of God." So they all said, "Are you the Son of God then?" And he said to them, "You say that I am." Then they said, "What further testimony do we need? We have heard it ourselves from his own lips." Then the whole company of them arose and brought him before Pilate. And they began to accuse him, saying, "We found this man misleading our nation and forbidding us to give tribute to Caesar, and saying that he himself is Christ, a king." And Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And he answered him, "You have said so." Then Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowds, "I find no guilt in this man." But they were urgent, saying, "He stirs up the people, teaching throughout all Judea, from Galilee even to this place." And when Pilate heard this, he asked whether the man was a Galilean. And when he learned that he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him over to Herod, who was himself in Jerusalem at that time. When Herod saw Jesus, he was very glad, for he had long desired to see him, because he had heard about him, and he was hoping to see some sign done by him. So he questioned him at some length, but he, Jesus, made no answer. The chief priests and the scribes stood by, vehemently accusing him. And Herod, with his soldiers, treated him with contempt and mocked him. Then, arraying him in splendid clothing, he sent him back to Pilate. And Herod and Pilate became friends with each other that very day, for before this they had been at enmity with each other. Pilate then called together the chief priests and the rulers and the people and said to them, "You brought me this man as one who was misleading the people, and after examining him before you, behold, I did not find this man guilty of any of your charges against him. Neither did Herod, for he sent him back to us. Look, nothing deserving death has been done by him. I will therefore punish him and release him." But they all cried out together, "Away with this man, and release to us Barabbas, a man who had been thrown into prison for an insurrection started in the city and for murder." Pilate addressed them once more, desiring to release Jesus, but they kept shouting, "Crucify him, crucify him." A third time he said to them, "Why, what evil has he done? I found in him no guilt deserving death. I will therefore punish and release him." But they were urgent, demanding with loud cries that he should be crucified. And their voices prevailed. So Pilate decided that their demand should be granted. He released the man who had been thrown into prison for insurrection and murder, for whom they asked, but he delivered Jesus over to their will. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks, Andrew, for reading all that. That was a lot. Let me just give a disclaimer here. Well, first, this isn't a disclaimer. This is it. My name's Joseph, by the way. It's good to see you. It's good to be with you this morning. Here's a disclaimer. So, as Tim introduced in his sermon last week, we're in the passion narratives of Jesus, and so the sermons are going to be a little heavier. And so I just want to be upfront with you today and say, this sermon's going to be heavy. My illustrations are going to be heavy, which is a good thing because we want to see Jesus as he is in this text. But I just wanted to let you know that that's where we're going. And the other thing, this isn't going to be like a 3-point sermon. I'm just going to try to tell the story of the text. So I'm going to pray for us, and I'm even just going to give us a second of just some silence as we kind of prepare our hearts for this text, prepare our hearts for what the Lord has for us. So let's bow our heads, close our eyes, and I'll give us a little bit of silence, and then I'll pray for us, and we'll get into the sermon. So, Lord Jesus, would you be present to us now? Would you be real to us now? Would the story leading up to your crucifixion, Lord, be real to us? Help us to see you afresh. We pray this in your name, Jesus. Amen. What does it take to kill a Messiah? And what does a dead Messiah mean for you? The story in Luke is drenched with irony. And one of the key ironies is the fact that a dead Messiah is good news for all of the characters in this story. And the question for us is, which character do we identify with? I've been reading through the diary of Anne Frank slowly. And in one sense, that's been a real gift. Just an insight into a moment of history in which so clearly darkness reigned. A clear moment in history when darkness reigned. And it's about, of course, Anne Frank, who's a young Jewish girl, born and went through the Holocaust, ended up dying right before the age of 16. And her story is tragic, but the diary helps personalize the story of 6 million Jews who went through extermination camps and were killed. Of course, she was hiding in a building with her family and a few other people. There's 8 of them total. And they were betrayed by someone in their office, they don't know who, for $1.40 per person. Before she was 16, she died in a camp in Belsen. And I still can't get over the fact, like reading through this, that the word used for these Jewish image bearers is extermination. Right? That's a word we talk about with killing cockroaches and termites. And that is how Jewish image bearers were treated, like cockroaches. They were treated like freight, herded into trains and separated from their families and sent into different death camps. And it's something that, as reading, it made me cry, but at the same time, it also made me like sick to my stomach, where my stomach is just churning and turning, right? How is this possible? And yet at the same time, this is exactly what it looks like when darkness reigns. The only one to survive from the 8 people who were hiding was her father, Otto Frank. And when he got back to Amsterdam, he got the diary that some friends had picked up when they were taken by the Gestapo. He sent it to some friends, and then it ended up getting published, and then was turned into a play. So in 1955, the first showing of the play was shown in Amsterdam, where all the real events took place. And so I want to read a description of what it was like the first time this play took place, right? A drama of when darkness reigns. And this was a description. In Amsterdam, Queen Juliana attended the play's opening on November 27th. This was the city where the events of the play had actually occurred, and many Netherlanders who had lost family and friends in the extermination of the Dutch Jews were in the audience. There were audible sobs, the New York Times correspondent reported, and one strangled cry as the drama struck its climax and conclusion, the sound of the Germans hammering at the door of the hideout. The audience sat in silence for several minutes after the curtain went down, and then rose as the royal party left. There was no applause. Today, we dive into a drama in which darkness reigns. In fact, this is exactly what Jesus says to Judas as he betrays him. He looks at Judas and he says, "This is your hour when darkness reigns." And so again, I ask you the question, what does a dead Messiah mean for you? Scene 1, Jesus beaten. After Peter denies Jesus, the next thing we know about Jesus' eyes, right? He makes eye contact with Peter as Peter is denying him a third time. The next thing we're told about Jesus' eyes is that he is blindfolded. Utter darkness comes over Jesus. Right? And when you're blindfolded, it's a disorienting experience. And either you have to really trust somebody or you are left completely and utterly vulnerable. You have no control over your surroundings, no way to anticipate. And that's what Jesus was, completely and utterly vulnerable. And we have a description that while he is blindfolded, he's surrounded by the temple guards, the chief priests, and some ruling leaders, and they begin mocking him. And he's mocked not just in words, but he's mocked by being beaten, that they're hitting him hand and fist with rods, and then calling out to him saying, "Who beat you? Prophesy. You're a prophet, right?" And if you ever had the wind knocked out of you when someone hits you in the stomach, or you get hit in the stomach, it paralyzes you. You can't move, right? You're waiting for your breath to come back. If you get hit in your jaw, your brain literally rattles in your head, and you become dizzy and disoriented. Getting hit in the nose, blood just pours out. And Jesus is receiving all of this, and while he's dizzy, disoriented, blinded, seeing darkness, voices are crying out, saying, "Prophesy, prophesy. You who call yourself Lord, you who call yourself a prophet." And I only imagine, right, when your eyes are covered, or when you can't see, all of your senses become heightened. You're feeling, you're hearing. And these loud voices are calling out as he's being beaten. And I think that's something that we always downplay, because it's really hard to get at how tragic and grotesque the amount of violence that Jesus went through. Okay, even the most honest depictions of Jesus' death and beating and whipping, all that thing, was take even the Passion of the Christ. Even that, we can't even fully handle, because Jesus himself, when he's on the cross, is hung naked. I mean, it's an immense amount of shame, of grotesque violence. And it's not just something that makes us sad. It's something that takes us into that sickness, that pain in the stomach, the churning of the amount of injustice that Jesus experiences from this point up to through his death. It reminds me of this scene. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie 12 Years a Slave. And it's about this guy, an African American who is taken from the north, captured, enslaved in the south, ends up on a plantation of a very evil person, very evil plantation owner. And there's this scene in which one of the other slave women is captured or is caught having taken some soap. And the owner is so mad, but he makes Solomon, the slave, do the whipping. And so he's performing the whipping on this woman, and it intensifies until her back is basically filleted. And as you watch it, you are just filled with disgust at the injustice that is taking place. And so too, this is Jesus' experience. This is the response to seeing what is taking place for Jesus. But Luke tells us something. He says, as they're beating him, they are blaspheming. And blaspheming has a very particular sense in terms of a Jewish context. It is slander against the name of the Lord. And that takes us into the clearest and deepest irony about this whole story. That as these men are beating and blaspheming the Lord, who is Jesus, Luke has called Jesus the Lord throughout the whole narrative. They're showing that these people have entirely missed God. And yet this is the very plan of God. That is the irony of this story, that all these people are missing God, and yet this is God's very plan. He is reigning and in control. So that's the setting, and it takes us into our rising action, our tension, scene 2, Jesus and the Sanhedrin. What does it take to kill a Messiah? We're a culture obsessed with murder movies, murder documentaries, how to make a murderer, stuff about Ted Bundy. Even Jack Black has a movie about murder, Bernie, it's called. And we're interested in the psychology. What does it take to get to a place to murder someone? And for these religious leaders, for the Sanhedrin, all that's needed is a good reason. And for their reason, for the chief priests, the scribes, the religious leaders, is that Jesus is a false prophet. According to Deuteronomy 13, if they can prove that Jesus is a false prophet, then he should be stoned, he should be killed. And so throughout this story, that's what they've been trying to do with Jesus. They've asked him about his take on taxes, the resurrection. They've asked him, why do you hang out with sinners? What about your Sabbath observance? They've done everything they can to try to trap Jesus, to prove that he is a false prophet. And so that's step one. But step two is they need to convince the Roman rulers that Jesus should be killed as well. Because as Jews in this time under Roman rule, only the Romans were allowed to commit capital punishment, perform capital punishment. And so they know the key question. They need Jesus to claim that he's a king. That's all they need. And so Jesus, eyes puffed, limping, bloodied, bruised, wakes up early in the morning and is taken before a council of religious leaders. Could be 71 people, a large crowd. And they come to him and they say, if you are the Christ, tell us. But Jesus responds, if I tell you, you will not believe. And if I ask you a question, you will not answer. So when Jesus speaks, he's referring back to all the dialogue that they've already been having. Think about it. In Luke 20, when they're at the temple, he says to them, hey, is John the Baptist's ministry legitimate or not? And they refuse to answer. And he knows that all they're seeking to do is trap him. So he's not interested in having a dialogue. They know that they don't believe. So instead of answering directly, he does something else. He quotes from Psalm 110, and he says this, but from now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the power of God. Psalm 110 is a psalm of David where he looks and has a vision of the throne room, and he sees that there is one greater than him, a king greater than him, a Messiah, a Lord who sits at the right hand of God. And it says this, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. And what Jesus is proclaiming, and what is powerful about this statement, is he says, from now on, this is true, that I am the one reigning. Which takes us into the deep irony that Jesus' glory begins and is most clearly seen when he's bloody, beaten, and dead. That is Jesus' glory most clearly revealed. And Paul picks up on this theme. He knows how does he know the glory of the Lord? By only Christ and him crucified. That the wisdom of God is foolishness to the world. But what's this? Is that Jesus is proclaiming them to be his enemies. And he says, there and then, Jesus is reigning over them. And they know Jesus is getting at this. And so they clarify, are you the Son of God then? And he answers in an ambiguous phrase in Greek. And it's basically, as you say so, or it's you who say it. In other words, Jesus has put the proclamation of his own messiahship in the mouths of men who don't believe it. That is the deep irony of this passage. But they don't care, right? They have their confession. They have the reason, and now they need to take this to Pilate. But I want to ask that question. What is the dead Messiah to the Sanhedrin? What does the dead Messiah mean to the Sanhedrin? Well, for them, it means they get to keep the status quo. You see, for Jesus, he comes to rock the boat. Whether for the Sanhedrin or anyone else, he does it for everyone. He doesn't come to maintain the status quo of your life. He comes to radically change it, to cause you to give up what is the social status and wealth of your day, to give up power to seek and serve others, to give up habits of sin to serve him. And the Sanhedrin doesn't want his kingdom. They don't want him. They hate him. They reject him. They want their kingdom, their status quo. A dead Messiah, a dead Jesus, means they don't have to change. Scene 3. Jesus and Pilate. To kill a Messiah, the religious leaders need to convince Pilate that their reason should be his reason. And so we see in 23:1 that they stand before Pilate, or Jesus stands before Pilate, and they come up with an accusation. Now, Pilate's a really intriguing figure. Okay, he's someone who's part of the Roman military system. He's worked his way up the hierarchy. And this little stint as a governor or a prefect in Judea is just a short stint. It's just like the U.S. military. It's just like a rigid structure of how to move up. And if he can just manage this area well, then he will be able to move on and step up and more power and gain more status in the Roman military. And so he just needs to prove to the emperor that he can keep the peace. And in the context of Rome, that basically just means keep people paying their taxes, keep them honoring Caesar, and keep them from rebellion. And however you make that happen doesn't matter. And so early in Pilate's career as a governor in Judea, there were several rebellions in which he dealt with it with a very heavy hand, slaughtering of people. But that didn't work to keep the peace. That only led to more rebellion amongst the Jews. And so he has had to turn his strategy to diplomacy, to trying to build relationships, to try to be more peaceable. And so when these Jewish leaders are coming to Pilate, there's two needs. The religious leaders need him so they can kill Jesus, and he needs to keep the peace. And so they bring Jesus before Pilate, and they present their case against Jesus. And the basic case is this. Jesus has been leading insurrections. He's an insurrectionist. This is repeated in verse 2, verse 5, verse 14. And this is how they describe it. They say that he has misled the Jewish nation, in which, number one, Jews hardly ever would refer to themselves as an ethne, a nation. That's how you refer to the foreign nations. And so they're trying to speak Pilate's language. They say he doesn't pay taxes. He tells people not to pay taxes, which isn't the full truth. That's not what Jesus had said. And that Jesus calls himself a Christ, or what they say, a king. Right? Pilate can't have people calling themselves kings. And so Pilate examines him. And he says to Jesus, Are you the king of the Jews? And he answers Jesus answers the same way he did to the Sanhedrin. It is as you say. Again, putting the confession of his kingship in the mouth of someone who doesn't believe it. But Pilate finds no guilt in Jesus. And so these religious leaders keep on insisting, saying he stirs up the people, teaching all over Judea, starting from Galilee, even as far as this place. And as soon as Pilate hears Galilee, he found his ticket out of this situation. Galilee, well, that's where Herod rules. I'm going to pass this off to him. I can wipe my hands of this, and I will continue ruling Judea well. This isn't my problem. And so he sends Jesus over to Herod. But I want to ask the question, what is a dead Messiah to Pilate and others like him? Well, for him, a dead Messiah means that he doesn't have to make a hard decision. He can keep the peace. He doesn't care about Jesus' innocence, nor does he care at all about what these Jewish leaders care about. He cares about himself, about keeping the peace so that he can move on. The Gospel of John proclaims or shares about this interaction and where Pilate says, what is truth? But obviously, Jesus is someone who provokes a response. His claims are radical. He is the one sitting at the right hand of God. And if that is the case, then that means that even Pilate would be his enemy. That you either have to love him or hate him, but for some, they'd rather just keep the peace, not have to decide. If Jesus is dead, then he's inconsequential. And this is true for Pilate. Scene 4, Jesus and Herod. Herod comes from a line of, and is part of a line of horrible people. His father, Herod the Great, he was all about building a massive palace for himself. You can actually go. I've been there. It's called the Herodium. It's just outside Bethlehem. It's like this mountain is turned into a major palace. He's also the one responsible for the killing of a bunch of infants in Matthew 2. Then you have this Herod and then another Herod after this Herod in this story. You see him in Acts. And they're known for their pride, their indulgence, for being murderers. They capitulated to Rome for their own benefit. But this Herod has heard about Jesus. Like many people who have heard from Jesus' followers, they've heard about him performing miracles, that he's done many signs. And so he's expecting when Jesus comes, he's excited. It says he's longed to see Jesus. For a long time, he's been hearing about him. And he's hoping that Jesus can show up and perform some of his magic tricks, that he can be a spectacle for Herod. And so he's asking him to do these things, and yet Jesus is silent, in which we see this decrescendo in which Jesus is speaking less and less, and to the point that he's silent and almost non-existent, just a passive participant in what's happening around him. Of course, which is to fulfill what Isaiah 53 says of Jesus, that he was oppressed, and as he was afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. That his voicelessness is the silent proclamation of what he has come to do, to be a suffering servant. But for Herod, he's just unimpressed. But all the while, these Jewish leaders have followed Jesus to Herod. They're desperate, they're pathetically desperate to get Jesus killed. And so they start telling Herod and accusing Jesus, and this only causes Herod not to take them seriously, but to then mock Jesus. Hearing that Jesus thinks himself a king, he puts on a bright purple robe on Jesus as if he's royalty, and then prances Jesus around in humiliation, almost like P.T. Barnum taking these misfits of people and humiliating them. And the deep irony is that as Herod has clothed Jesus like a king for the sake of humiliation, all the while Jesus is reigning as king. Herod finds nothing wrong with Jesus, but he neither sets him free nor condemns him, leaving Jesus still trapped and the chief priests without a resolution. What does a dead Messiah mean to Herod? It just means the end of a myth. Right? He just heard stories about Jesus, that he's some miracle worker. Jesus was an interesting spectacle that he heard about from some people who loved him and people who hated him. But a dead Messiah to him was just the end of a myth. Getting worked up about a myth is a waste of time. That's true for Herod and for other people. So Jesus is sent back to Pilate, which brings us to scene 5, Jesus and Barabbas. As Luke describes it, Pilate and Herod have been enemies until this point, that they now have become friends in the murder of Jesus. And Pilate is before the ruling elders, and again, he's trying to persuade them. Look, I don't see anything wrong with Jesus. He says, you brought this man to me as one who incites the people to rebellion. And behold, having examined him before you, I find no guilt. Not even Herod, for he has sent him back to us. Behold, nothing deserving death has been done to him. Therefore, I will punish him and release him. Right? Pilate proclaims Jesus' innocence. He's done nothing wrong, which is Pilate's own claim to his own guilt. By declaring Jesus innocent, he claims his own guilt. By not standing up for him, he wants to keep the peace. But the religious leaders want nothing of that. And as Jesus' voice has become silent, now the voice of the leaders is becoming louder and louder and louder. And so they cry out, away with this man Jesus and release for us Barabbas. He was one who's been thrown into prison for an insurrection made in the city and for murder. We know two things about Barabbas. We know what he's done and we know his name. What he's done? Well, he's done the very thing that they're trying to kill Jesus for. Insurrection and rebellion. He's one actually guilty of the things that Jesus is being accused of. But the second thing is we know his name. His name is Bar Abba, which translated means son of the Father. And so in this moment, Luke is bringing out this deep irony that Barabbas is convicted, is a known criminal facing the charges that Jesus is known to be innocent for. And yet they want to release Barabbas and keep Jesus in prison to kill him, showing that they have no concern about resurrection or about rebellion, but instead that they only want to kill Jesus. And so they exchange one son of a father for the son of the Father. Yet the tension keeps building. Pilate again says, I will just punish him. But they kept on calling out, saying, crucify, crucify him. And he said to them the third time, why? What evil has he done? I have found in him no guilt demanding death. Therefore, I will punish him and release him. But they were insistent with loud voices, asking that he be crucified. You can see this mob is turning into the very thing that Pilate does not want, which is another rebellion, that he has to quell it. And so finally, at this climactic point, as these voices are louder and louder, this mob is reaching out, saying, crucify Jesus. He acquiesces. Verse 24, Pilate pronounced Jesus' sentence and gave them their demand. And the resolution, he released the man, Barabbas, they were asking for, who had been thrown into prison for insurrection and murder, but he delivered Jesus to their will. The word delivered there is really important. It's the word paradidomi in Greek, and it's used in different ways, but the key place that it shows up is in Romans 1, in which you have this passage about people giving up worship of the true God for worship of idols. And in response to that, God pronounced judgment. And the way he pronounced judgment was giving them over by delivering them, paradidomi. He paradidomied them over to their lusts. He paradidomied them over to their hatred, to their sexual impurities, to not honoring their parents, to lust, to greed. God gave them over, that this is the sign of judgment, that God gives people over to sinful desires. And so here, we have Jesus receiving the judgment. He is given over to sinful desire. And it's obvious what Luke is doing by, in verse 25, putting together a man who is in prison for insurrection and murder, the thing that Jesus is clearly innocent for, and having Jesus the one receiving the judgment for it. So for Barabbas, or for those who are guilty of grievous sins, what does the death of the Messiah mean for them, for him? It means new life. He's on death row. He is condemned for sin, for murder, and insurrection. He's sitting under the wrath of Rome, waiting to be killed. And in his final hour, his place was taken by a Messiah who's been given over to the sinful will of other people. The death of a Messiah meant he would go free. The death of a Messiah meant a substitute. The death of a Messiah means new life. This is the drama that Luke gives to us as the drama when darkness reigns, that we peer into that story. And what does it take to kill a Messiah? Well, it takes God working through religious leaders trying to keep their status quo, a Roman governor trying to keep the peace, an indifferent Herod who doesn't care about the myth of Jesus, and it takes a guilty man in need of a substitute. And so I ask you, what does a dead Messiah mean for you?